periphery of the world economy, dating back to the classical era of imperialism. I mean, we haven't got time to go into a great deal of detail, but I guess the most famous example of it is Rudyard Kipling's poem, The White Man's Burden. Now, I don't choose this because of the racial connotations. I'm not suggesting that these doctrines are racist. That's not my point at all. But this is a poem that's very often cited, but very rarely quoted. And in fact, it was written by Kipling in 1899, specifically addressing the United States of America as a new imperial power. So it's a message from an old imperial power, Britain, to a new imperial power in reference to the US's acquisition of the Philippines after the Spanish-American War. And Kipling's message is explicitly that the United States has not only a right, but a responsibility to intervene in the Philippines. And so the poem urges Americans to take up the white man's burden, the savage wars of peace, to fill full the mouth of famine, and bid the sickness cease. So in these lines you have all the key doctrines, all the key rhetoric that we hear now about interventions like Libya. We might mention in passing that in fact the United States did fight the savage wars of peace in the Philippines, with the result that between 1 million and 1.5 million people died. Now, what makes, I think, responsibility to protect seem like a new kind of political doctrine, a new sort of rhetorical trope today, is that these kind of ideas were widely discredited, both by the sort of wave of anti-colonial struggles after the Second World War, and specifically by the Vietnam War. But since then, they've been returning in full effect. And of course, there's another immediate example that we can turn to, which is of course the war in Afghanistan. And it's often forgotten now how much the intervention in Afghanistan was couched, certainly on the liberal left, as a humanitarian intervention. People will remember the late Pamela Bone, the feminist activist and columnist with the Melbourne Age, who put a very, very forceful case that the Taliban were so misogynistic, so oppressive, and so authoritarian, all of which were true, that therefore the left had a responsibility to endorse military intervention to remove the Taliban. And the reason we don't hear that much now about Afghanistan as an example of humanitarian interventions is because, of course, the intervention in Afghanistan did not result in liberation for Afghan women, let alone the Afghan populace, but instead has resulted in 10 years of continuous war and an occupation that has achieved the dubious outcome of making large sectors of the population in Afghanistan actually susceptible to the Taliban once again, because the Karzai regime is so corrupt and so brutal. And the reason why I mention this example is because there was no doubt that Pamela Bone was sincere in her wishes for a better life for the women of Afghanistan, and had nothing but good intentions. But the outcome of the intervention in Afghanistan should suggest to us that good intentions are not enough. And I think that's really, really important, because if you look at the Libya intervention, what we are seeing here is an intervention in which the liberal left has signed on the basis of very little other than good intentions. Because, of course, we are now 5 weeks into military action, and it's almost impossible to get a consensus on what the strategic aims of this intervention are, how they might be achieved, and most importantly, how this intervention might be brought to a close. And in that respect, I think that what we might call the humanitarian left has very much written a blank cheque to this intervention. And of course, the last time we saw this happen was in 2003, when again, it's forgotten that sizable chunks of the liberal left signed on to the Iraq War on a humanitarian basis. And that war led to between the deaths of 150,000 and 1 million people. So these are serious matters that should not be signed onto lightly. And I think it's important to consider the political context, because it is a very, very strange situation. We now have a situation where Barack Obama, who was elected as the anti-war candidate, has now not only not withdrawn from Afghanistan or Iraq, but is now taking responsibility for a third overseas war. And he's doing so not in the face of opposition from, but with the blessing of sizable chunks of his own constituency. It is a very, very strange situation. And so how does it come to this? I think it's really important to analyse the tropes of humanitarianism in this context, because they are something of a constant. There's a few things that turn up again and again. The first thing is a degree of hyperbole. You remember in the context of the Libya intervention, we were repeatedly told that the fall of Benghazi would entail something approaching a genocide of the proportions for Rwanda. And I think this is patently not true. In fact, we have seen the areas that have fallen under control of Gaddafi where there have been massacres, there have been human rights violations, but they have not been of the scale of Rwanda. And I'm not saying this to minimise the brutality of the regime. It is a brutal regime. They are conducting atrocities. But there are enough genuine atrocities taking place without engaging in this kind of hyperbole. The second aspect, the second trope that's repeated again and again, is the trope of urgency. The decisions must be made now, that there is no time to consider, and if you don't sign in at once, you are then endorsing whatever atrocity is taking place. And I'll come back to this and the way this plays itself through if I get time, which I suspect I probably won't. But thirdly, and most importantly, humanitarian interventions are always posited, not just, they're posited as being aggressively ahistorical, to the sense that in most occasions they are actually abstracted from any kind of historical context, and they're presented to you almost like a moral example in a philosophy 101 class. Do you support the intervention, or do you allow these people to die? And when it's presented like that, the question contains its own answer. But of course, you can't understand a situation like Libya without putting it in a historical context. Aside from anything else, it leaves you incapable of answering the simplest of questions. I mean, the obvious question that arises with the Libyan intervention is, if it is necessary and justified to intervene to prevent a potential massacre taking place in Benghazi, why then is it not necessary to intervene to protect an actual massacre that is taking place in Bahrain? It was taking place on the day that the NATO strikes were first launched, and is in fact still taking place. And I'm not raising this to make the charge of hypocrisy, because I don't think that's the point. The point is that the situation in Bahrain is connected to the situation in Libya, and you can't understand them without seeing them in context. So I want to briefly talk about Libya in the context of the Arab Revolution, because I think that's the framework that's necessary to understand what's taking place. Very, very briefly, the Libyan Revolution was inspired directly by events in Tunisia and events in Egypt. And those events were not civil wars. They were social revolutions. They were political struggles being fought by one layer of the population against another layer of the population. And that's very, very important in understanding why the death toll in the revolutionary struggle in Egypt, for instance, was so very, very low. In fact, Mubarak's regime is just as repressive as Gaddafi's regime. It was a torture centre of the Middle East. But in fact, the death toll in that revolution was very, very low. Why? Because the revolutionaries were not seeking to blow away Mubarak's supporters with heavy weapons and tanks and the rest of it. They were waging a political struggle, a struggle being led by ordinary workers, ordinary students and the unemployed, that aimed to convince Mubarak's allies to break with Mubarak and join the revolution. And so when the dictator sent in the army to crush the revolution into the square, what he would find is either the units would refuse to leave the barracks, or they would come and join the revolutionary process. And that was why President Obama was able to praise the power of non-violence in Egypt. And that was the basis on which the Libyan revolution began. What we have now in Libya, and it's perhaps true there was a process that was already underway, but it's been grotesquely accentuated by the NATO intervention, is not a social revolution. We have a conventional civil war. And it's a very, very different situation. We have now not a struggle being fought by different layers of society. We have a war being waged increasingly by professional soldiers using heavy weapons on both sides, fighting from different geographical locations. And the implications of this are quite profound. Firstly, and most obviously, it means the death toll is very high and is going to become higher. Partly because heavy weapons by their nature are indiscriminate on both sides, and partly because the nature of a civil war is such that it fosters atrocities. And while Colonel Gaddafi's atrocities have been widely reported and are genuinely disturbing and should be condemned, it's not being reported that the other side are also now committing atrocities, and such is what you would expect in a civil war. That's what happens in civil wars. But more importantly, the nature of a civil war means that the humanitarian objectives that the NATO mission was sold on cannot be achieved. If you recall, the whole basis on which political support was sought for this venture was the idea that the NATO intervention was necessary to protect the civilian activists amongst the rebels from Gaddafi's reprisals. And now it's true that NATO prevented the fall of Benghazi and thus protected the civilian population there. But what's never discussed is what are the implications for the civilian population in the other areas of Libya, specifically in the main population centre, which is Tripoli. Because when the revolution was a revolution, when it was being fought between different sections of society, there were many, many revolutionary activists in Tripoli who were engaged in that struggle of attempting to win over the army, of attempting to agitate, of holding demonstrations and all the rest of it. Now, however, that social revolution has become a civil war fought largely from different geographical locations with heavy weaponry. Not only is it very, very difficult to wage that kind of political struggle, but Gaddafi's forces in Tripoli have been massively strengthened by his rhetorical stance of being able to position himself as an Arab nationalist defending himself against foreign attackers. So what that meant, and there is nothing that NATO can do to protect the civilian population of Tripoli. So while the civilian population of Benghazi has been defended, what we expect to happen is all the atrocities that people were talking about in Benghazi being inflicted on people in Tripoli. And that is in fact what's been taking place. They're being rounded up, they're being arrested, they're being tortured and all the rest of it. And there is nothing NATO can do to prevent this. So as a humanitarian outcome, the entire premise was very, very shaky from the start. So what then was the basis of it? Why launch this operation? Again, it seems to me that you have to understand it in context. That the revolutions that were sweeping the Arab world in Tunisia, in Egypt, and at the beginning in Libya were explicitly anti-American. Because the Arab world is a very resource-rich area, and for nearly 70 years, the policies of the United States have been to favour stability and friendly regimes over democracy, which has meant they have backed most of the worst dictators in the region. People will have seen that demonstrators in Egypt holding up the tear gas canisters that were fired at them that said on the side, "Made in the USA," because the United States has provided billions of dollars for Mubarak for many years. So when the revolutions first began, they were revolutions against pro-US regimes. In Tunisia and in Egypt, and initially the same sentiment was present in the rebellion in Libya. When the rebellion in Libya began to falter, the United States and its NATO allies saw an opportunity to insert themselves into this process, and so to shift the dynamic from a revolt against the US and its allies to a civil war in which the United States is playing a leading role. And that's allowed NATO to do two things. The first is to increasingly determine the personnel of the Libyan rebellion. And you'll note that increasingly these spokespeople are turning up as being the representatives of the Libyan revolution. The revolution began with the ordinary students and the ordinary workers. Increasingly, the spokespeople, emigres from outside that have been parachuted in, usually with Western backing, who are now being put forward as spokespeople. So the New York Times yesterday had this extraordinary story about the so-called leaders of the military wing of the rebels. One of them is a guy called Haddad, who has spent the last 20 years living in Longley, Virginia, where he's been the payroll of the CIA. He's a Libyan immigrant who's now been returned to head the armed forces of the revolution. And the other one is a guy called Yunus, who until February was Colonel Gaddafi's best friend, and was in fact a leading figure in the Gaddafi regime. Now, the tragic comedy of it is that they're now jostling for each other for who is actually controlling the army of the revolution. But the figures who are now emerging as the leaders of this civil war are those who have the ear of the United States. So that's the first part. They are able to control the personnel. But secondly, and more importantly, they are able to shape the social content of this civil war. The aspect that's never spoken about at all was that the revolutions that broke out in Tunisia, in Egypt, and in Libya, also about economic issues. But all three countries had been engaged for about the last 5 or 6 years with savage neoliberal experiments. They were being hailed as neoliberal powerhouses with all that goes along with that. Mass unemployment, wage cuts, and all the rest of it. So the revolutions that broke out in these countries had an economic basis. And the key issue in Tunisia was unemployment. So the other aspect of the NATO intervention is to ensure that the revolution in Libya does not have a radical economic program. And so you'll note, and again, it hasn't been reported very much, but one of the key developments is the rebels have now signed an agreement. They will honour all the oil treaties that Gaddafi had entered into. So I think we can see what is it the NATO is seeking to get out of this. Yes, they want Gaddafi to go, but in place of Gaddafi, what they want is a regime that is pro-US politically and pro-market economically. And because of that, and because both of those things would be very unpopular in the context, such a regime would almost certainly be authoritarian as well. Which is why there are so many ex-Gaddafi loyalists who are now presenting themselves as key figures in the revolution. So what then will be the outcome of this process? Well, it's very, very difficult to say. It's possible that these diplomatic efforts to get Gaddafi to leave will bear fruit, and they will be able to affect some kind of regime change. But what will happen then? Remember, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, regime change is the easy part. What happens after that? What are the consequences of the forces that have been unleashed in this civil war? The various hatreds, the various tribal divisions that have been stirred up. What are the consequences of that? If Gaddafi's support base, and it's quite clear that Gaddafi has a support base, perhaps more of a support base than Saddam Hussein did. If Gaddafi's support base is not won over to the revolution, if they are chased out by NATO airstrikes, you have the perfect conditions for an insurgency. If they are not chased out by NATO airstrikes and they remain in power and there's change at the top, well then you have the perfect conditions for a military dictatorship. So I think even if NATO is able to affect regime change, I think the long-term future is very, very grim. And these interventions need to be measured not in terms of the short-term achievements, but the consequences for decades. But the other thing, of course, is it's increasingly unlikely that regime change is on the agenda. I mean, the other speakers have touched upon this, that it seems like militarily the civil war has become something of a stalemate, and that airstrikes are not enough to defeat Gaddafi. So what happens then? Okay, there's talk now that the EU might send in troops, but are they really going to send in troops all the way into Tripoli to fight Gaddafi house by house? If they actually did this, we'd be looking at something very similar to some of the worst fighting that took place in Iraq. It's not only that the humanitarian consequences of that will be disastrous, it's very unlikely that the political will exists to do it. And furthermore, it should be said that Obama and Cameron in the UK are both presiding over savage austerity measures. So it's very unlikely that the population are going to sign on to this project. So if this doesn't happen, if there's not regime change, what happens then? I mean, previously it was mooted early on that the outcome may well be some sort of partition, a balkanisation of Libya. Well, you know, there are reasons why the Balkans were at the centre of every major war that took place in Europe in the 20th century. Because you create these mini statelets from the outside. It's a recipe for instability and for violence. And aside from anything else, if that took place, what happens to all the supporters of the revolution who are in Tripoli, who are essentially then just handed over to Gaddafi? So it seems to me the humanitarian outcomes from this intervention are very, very hard to see, and I suspect that we're dealing with the consequences of this for a long, long time to come. And I think increasingly the revolutionaries in Libya, who you cannot blame in their desperation for calling for NATO airstrikes. What else? You can understand why they did it, but increasingly they are beginning to feel that they have been sold a pup by NATO. That NATO cannot deliver the promises that it's made, and the outcome is going to be very, very dire. There is, of course, the question of what should have happened and what the alternatives might have been, but I think I've probably run out of time, so perhaps we're not going to talk about that in this discussion.
We've got about 20 minutes for questions, so I might just bring... Yeah, and there's also one for us. So, it might be time for questions, and I can see a question there. In fact, there's quite a few. So we'll start off with Lizzie in the centre, and then...
This is just a question for Don. I'm going to call you Don. If the international rule of law, so to speak, is something that's applied indiscriminately by countries like the United States, and it's hypocritically put in place or it's selectively applied, and the application is invariably results in a number of civilian casualties, is there any basis on which you can defend it as universal or as something other than a cover for imperialism? Because I can understand why there might be a distinction between law and morality, but it does call to question why we should defend an international rule of law if there is no relationship with morality. So I wonder if you could touch on that, please.
I take the position that it's not appropriate to really single out the United States in this instance. The United States was not a prime promoter of the responsibility to protect doctrine. And indeed, when the General Assembly was considering this matter in the middle of the last decade, the Bush administration was in place, and the US had a very antagonistic position towards the UN at that point in time. I agree with everything that Gideon had to say about the US position and the apparent inconsistency that it's taken in terms of, say, the International Criminal Court, and to that end it is very difficult to reconcile a position whereby it's happy to vote in favour of the resolution to refer the situation in Libya to the ICC, and yet it still wishes to remain at arm's length from the Council. But I think my ultimate response to you is that at the end of the day, the US has one vote. There are 4 other states who have absolutely pivotal votes in terms of the adoption of these resolutions. And even if the US and Ambassador Susan Rice, who was certainly very vocal in terms of promoting an R2P approach in the case of Libya, even if their views were considered to be so persuasive that the other members of the Council were prepared to go along with them, why didn't Russia and China seek to veto those resolutions? And if you read the Security Council debate for 1973, it's clear that those countries had reservations. So I have some difficulty in terms of saying that the US is particularly responsible for this. I have some sympathy for your view about the inconsistency that the US takes in terms of rule of law, but in terms of looking at R2P and these Security Council resolutions, I see it much more as a collective response from the international community.
My question's more to the latter two speakers, that I think both of you highlighted the kind of unquestionable messiness of the intervention and the lack of clarity about what's going to come. I just wanted to ask a question that I think the last speaker left hanging in the air a little bit about what are the alternatives that I can see in Gaddafi's situation that perhaps the social revolution wouldn't succeed because he was nasty enough to stop it happening. And I just wonder about the question about moral responsibility and that if it's not intervention, then what is it? I know that's probably not your job, I'm just interested in your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, this is the way the question is always presented, isn't it? There's an atrocity about to take place. What are we going to do to stop it? I guess I reject the way the question is framed. I mean, for a whole series of reasons. The first one is that it's always, this is what I mean about these things always being positive, as being urgent and we need to act now. But the problem is that yesterday's humanitarian interventions produced today's massacres. I mean, the obvious example of that is Afghanistan, where we need to act now to overturn the Taliban. And again, there was an urgency about it. Anyone who didn't sign on to it was supporting repression of women and all the rest of it. We need to act now to stop the Taliban. Where did the Taliban come from? The Taliban were the direct result of an earlier decision to send huge shipments of arms to the people who were fighting, the Mujahideen who were fighting the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. And that's why I think that it's not enough simply to talk about what are we going to do about this current situation. One needs to have a long-term perspective. I mean, it's been raised in all seriousness. Like one of the earlier speakers mentioned it, about sending heavy weaponry into Libya. Okay, you can do that, and but then what are the long-term consequences of that? So that's the first point. The second point is this question of what are we going to do? Who is the we that's being addressed? I mean, I guess most of the time the we is the great powers, I think the international community is a terrible euphemism, to be perfectly honest. It makes it sound like Sesame Street. Everyone's borrowing cups of sugar from each other and all the rest of it. But if the we is the great powers, I think the most important thing to say to that is the key agency in the Arab Revolution is not the great powers. In fact, the great powers are the key obstacle. That the revolutions that were taking place in Tunisia and Egypt in particular were directed against the great powers. And it seems to me that if there is going to be any long-term solution in Libya, it will come from the Libyan people and it will come from the people of the region. And that's the framework in which one has to look for solutions. Now, specifically, what might have been done in the situation in Benghazi? Well, it depends on a whole series of things, many of which are unclear. I think the fundamental question that I haven't seen answered in much of the commentary is how much social support do the rebels in Libya have? I mean, do we know the answer to that? Because that is a question that shapes what agency you have for action. I mean, if there's no social basis for the revolution, it's not going to succeed. Again, that doesn't fully answer your question, but I feel I could just go on for a long time. So.
First of all, thank you for a wonderful panel. I think it was a great spread of expertise and a very enjoyable panel, so thank you for that. My question goes to Don. You noted, Don, that Resolution 1973 prohibits an occupying force, but then went on to say that doesn't necessarily preclude boots on the ground. So my question is, where is the line? At what point do boots on the ground become an occupying force? So, for instance, if the forces in Iraq were to say, we're actually security back up for a transitional government, none of us would buy that. So how far from there do we have to walk it back before we would buy that? Where's the line between boots on the ground and an occupying force, legally speaking?
Thanks, Adam. So the way that I interpreted that was in the context of Geneva Convention 4, and behaviour regulations also give us some insight into how we might see an occupying force. I think you're quite right that it is quite difficult to sometimes draw the line, and I would interpret any intervention of large-scale forces which would effectively be trying to to sweep aside the Gaddafi Libyan military and to then immediately administer or control and regulate and provide security for that territory which they had effectively liberated as clearly an occupation. And so in that situation, the provisions of Geneva Convention 4 would clearly be applicable. That's why I think that any military intervention going beyond the sort of special forces or very limited military assistance that the British have announced overnight could only be supportable if it was completely in tandem with an interim government, a provisional government, or some other recognised authority, whether that would be, I suspect, probably in eastern Libya, who would be directly engaged with the Libyan military forces. Now, part of the problem with that is that you and I know, and many of us in this audience would know, that it then becomes, as you're suggesting, a very fine point between when you are working collaboratively, consistently within the UN mandate and going beyond that. And I think that's why there is, I think, very justifiable caution at the moment. And I think that caution is especially important because given that this is the first time that R2P has been militarily operationalised, there have been other instances where R2P has been relied upon, but this is the first time it's been militarily operationalised. The precedent that it creates in terms of how the UN and the Security Council views it is absolutely crucial to whether it has any future.
Thanks very much to the three speakers. Just to pick up on that last response, it's probably coming up for about midday now in Libya, and Misrata is still under attack. It's been under siege for several weeks now. And I know that there's concern about that because the intervention in Benghazi was very swift, whereas Gaddafi's troops are now on the outskirts of Misrata, and in fact snipers are firing from mosques and schools, tanks are parked there. So this, I guess, creates a bit of a conundrum. Because of the intervention that we've had to date, there's some sort of expectation. And I was just wondering if any of the speakers had any thoughts on ways around the conundrum at the moment. Does NATO or the UN pull back? Do they engage more? Because it's, effectively a medieval siege now. So if you have any food for thought, that would be great.
I'll say one or two things and then maybe others will want to say something about it as well. I think the answer to that is that there's no obvious answer to that, and it can't be addressed within the framework of the resolution and the effect of implementation of that resolution today. So, we've had airstrikes, we've had, as we always have in these interventions, there's been some immediate success, taking out of military assets and neutralising the capacity of Gaddafi's forces to do certain things. But, of course, he has many resources. And so what's happening in Misrata now is likely to continue to be a problem, and as I alluded to in my talk, without a ground force in Libya, it's hard to see how these sorts of situations like Misrata are going to be resolved either way. Either the fighting will continue, there'll be support, whether it be by way of military support, strategic assistance, by continued bombings where appropriate and possible. But that seems to be less and less likely to achieve the goal of defeating Gaddafi's forces. So, to be honest with you, I don't see a resolution to it.
Thanks. My question was for the third speaker. You mentioned in your response to another question just previously about the need to consider the long-term perspective and the long-term consequences
My question is, presumably there's a flip side to that, which is also the need to consider the long-term consequences and perspective of not intervening to protect civilians, for example in Rwanda. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not advocating for atrocities against civilians. I guess it's a question of where you think the agency to prevent these things comes from. And it seems to me, well, one of the things that was remarkable is if you look at Egypt, we saw more social change there in the space of a few weeks than we'd seen in previous decades. And, you know, it's interesting to compare the methods that we used in Egypt, say, to the methods that were used in Iraq, and the different consequences that ensued from them. So it seems to me that the difficulty that I have with the legal way these questions are posed is that they are predicated on the agent for preventing injustice in the world is inevitably the major nations that must intervene from the outside to set things to right. And I think there's all sorts of objections to that. I mean, there's the historical objections that very rarely works, that these interventions very often leave the situation much worse than they find it. But there's also the theoretical objection, I guess, that the political implications of political change coming from within a society are considerably different than the political implications of a war being waged externally. I mean, I think in the situation of Libya, that, as I said, the long-term solution depends very much on what happens in the region as a whole. So this was a revolution that was inspired by Egypt, and one of the difficulties in Libya is that the revolution in Egypt is now stalled. And I have trouble with the way that these things are framed as if these are problems that we are going to solve. That there are political problems that need to be dealt with here, but there are political problems that need to be dealt with in the region by the people of the region.
Hi. I guess I just had a question that sort of touched on everything that all three of you have been talking about. I was interested in the stance that the Arab League and the African Union had taken towards this. And so I was wondering whether the stance that they take, they're a lot more positive than I would have expected them to be. Was this more because of the historical context that it's, that it's happened at a time when we're more willing to intervene in other countries? Or is it something specific to Libya? Thank you.
Well, I mean, again, it's the problem with this framework. These are strange institutions, and these are not tremendously democratic institutions. Most of the member states of them are dictatorships, and I just find it very hard to draw too many moral conclusions from decisions made in bodies like that. I mean, the Asia Times is reporting that the vote in the Arab League was secured on the basis that Hillary Clinton agreed that Saudi Arabia would play a role in suppressing the pro-democracy movement in Bahrain. Now, whether this is true or not, I don't know. I mean, there have been various allegations to that effect. But the difficulties of these institutions is the member states of them are undemocratic, and the decisions are made by all kinds of horse trading. I mean, the parallel, of course, is the United Nations. The decisions are made in the United Nations and resolutions are taken, and these have legal effects, as we've heard. But what are the moral basis for it? I mean, should we really feel bound by an institution that basically reflects the world's balance of power after World War II? And that's what it reflects. Doesn't reflect anything more moral than that. And I think the Arab League is even more so than that case. I feel I'm losing the thread of the question now, so I'll just be quiet.
Can I just say that I think your question is a good one in the sense that alongside the role of the Arab League and the African Union, at much the same time as these events were occurring, as Jeff has alluded to, you had the Gulf Cooperation Council intervening in Bahrain at the request of the Bahrainis. And there was some understandable pushback from the United States as a result of that event. So it's very, very difficult, I think, because of the political nature of these organisations to read any consistency into the way that they're acting. I just guess I would like to challenge one aspect of what Jeff has said, and that is that in my talk I alluded to the case of East Timor. Whilst East Timor is a difficult case to clearly fit within humanitarian intervention, because ultimately Indonesia did accept the legitimacy of the Security Council resolution. Who led the UN-mandated intervention? I don't think anyone in this room would probably say Australia is a great power, and yet Australia led that intervention. Who was the second in command, effectively, of INTERFET? It was a Filipino general, and indeed, in addition to Australia and the Philippines and New Zealand, most of the contributors to INTERFET were all regional players. And ultimately, I think that perhaps gave it more legitimacy because it was regional powers. It wasn't a regional organisation, but it was regional powers, regional players, states who actually contributed to that intervention, albeit under a UN mandate and albeit with Indonesian acceptance of that intervention. But I think it does highlight one of the ways in which, if any military interventions are going to occur for these humanitarian objectives, that does point to one of the key aspects of success.
Yes, thank you. Jeff Sparrow's effort to put the Arab situation in a historical context was very good. I would have liked him to have gone further and to have said that the Arab world, since the end of the Second World War, has been divided roughly into two groups. Those who are propped up under bought peace arrangements by the United States and dictatorships supporting the United States, and those which have become dictatorships in isolation because of opposition to the United States policies. And that the United States has been manoeuvring and fomenting trouble in each of the countries in order to disrupt and disunify the Arab world very successfully. And I found Dr. Rothwell's reference to the international community unfortunate. I'd like him to expand on that or clarify that in a moment, because when you have less than 2/5 of the world's people represented by governments which support the current involvement in Libya, then I don't think it is the international community that should be referred to. It is the white Western Christian world which is dominating that effort. And since the turn of events of recent weeks, Russia, China and India, representing far more people than those who support the American effort, American-dominated effort, are against it. And to expand a no-fly zone, which should be what it means and what has been interpreted in many areas previously, to simply keep planes out of the sky once they've taken off in an offensive operation, to convert that into the absolute destruction of an air force outside of any area of operation without a plane taking off is hardly a justified no-fly zone.
I was going to say that the international community, I agree, is a term that perhaps means different things to different people in different settings, but ultimately, for those of us who look at international institutions such as the United Nations and the Security Council, we really see it as predominantly being the members, the member states of the United Nations. Now, obviously there are a whole series of other players who have significant roles, but ultimately when I'm speaking about the adoption of Security Council resolutions, or when the General Assembly endorses principles like responsibility to protect, it is the member states who do so. I accept the position that you've made that a number of UN member states have expressed significant reservations and concerns about the way in which the NATO campaign is being conducted, and to that end I referred to this concern about mission creep, which I think was part of your observation. Of course, it is always open to those states, especially Russia and China and India, which is currently a member of the Security Council, to seek to introduce its own resolution, to seek to scale back and to seek to place limitations on the way in which Security Council Resolution 1973 is being implemented. And I think that one needs to acknowledge that that's the way the Security Council operates. It's a political organisation, and so that option is always open to those states if they feel so strongly about that particular matter.
Okay, we'll have to bring proceedings to an end there. We've already gone a bit over time, and it sounds like it's very wet, if not possibly cold out there as well. So I guess I just jotted down a couple of ideas, because one thing that has arisen in, I guess, a lot of the talks is, well, what is going to be the end game? What's going to happen here? None of us can predict that. I've just got a few dot points of what could possibly happen. One is the sudden crumbling of the regime. Kosovo, we brought up Kosovo, and my memory of Kosovo is there was 8 weeks of bombing and a lot of despair that it would never lead to anything, and then suddenly the Milosevic regime did crumble. That may not happen. We may just have another long and endless international war. We may have a situation like Somalia where the internationals pull out but the civil war continues. We could have, as Jeff mentioned, the balkanisation of the country. We could have Colonel Gaddafi appearing before the International Criminal Court. We could have, as has been discussed now, Colonel Gaddafi ending up in some sort of immunity, or with de facto immunity, because he ends up in a state like seeking refuge in a state like Zimbabwe, which is not a party. We could have boots on the ground, we may not. So it's clearly a very controversial issue tonight. You've heard, I think, you've benefited from some expertise in the areas of legal views, political views and historical views. So will you please join me in thanking our speakers tonight, Don Rothwell,